The rope tightened around Jacob's neck as the morning sun bled crimson across the Texas horizon. 3 men from Fort Gibson stood behind him, their faces stone cold with the promise of military justice. Below the makeshift gallows, a crowd of settlers had gathered like vultures, their eyes hungry for the execution of the deserter who had brought shame upon them all. "Any last words, Whitmore?" Colonel Hayes spat, his weathered hand gripping the lever that would send Jacob into eternity. Jacob's blue eyes, now dulled by months of running and hiding, gazed not at his executioners, but toward the distant mesas where smoke signals still danced against the sky. His lips parted to speak, but the words that emerged were not in English. They were in Comanche, the language that had become his second tongue, the language that had cost him everything. He whispered, asterisk.
Asterisk.
The people will remember.
Asterisk.
Asterisk. 6 months earlier. Asterisk. Asterisk.
Asterisk.
The fort at Gibson buzzed with the nervous energy of men preparing for war. Captain Jacob Whitmore stood at attention in the commanding officer's tent, his uniform pressed to perfection, his conscience already beginning to fray at the edges. Outside, soldiers loaded wagons with ammunition and supplies for what Colonel Hayes called the final push, a campaign to drive the Comanche from their ancestral hunting grounds once and for all. "These savages have been raiding our settlements for too long," Hayes declared, stabbing a thick finger at the map spread across his desk. "The railroad needs this land cleared, and by God we'll clear it. Every man, woman, and child of fighting age is to be considered hostile." Jacob's stomach lurched. He had joined the cavalry to protect innocent settlers, not to wage war on entire tribes. But orders were orders, and questioning them meant court-martial, or worse. The campaign began at dawn, 300 soldiers strong, marching toward the sacred grounds of the Comanche. Jacob rode near the front, his horse's hooves beating a rhythm that seemed to echo the drumbeat of his troubled heart. He had heard stories of these lands, how the Comanche buried their dead here, how their ancestors' spirits were said to walk among the red rocks and flowing streams. It was on the 3rd day that everything changed. The ambush came without warning. War cries split the morning air as Comanche warriors descended from the canyon walls like avenging spirits. Arrows whistled past Jacob's ears as he fought to control his panicking horse. Around him, soldiers fell, their blood soaking into the earth they had come to claim. In the chaos, Jacob found himself separated from his unit, pursued by 2 young Comanche braves through a maze of narrow canyons. His horse stumbled, throwing him hard against the rocky ground. Pain shot through his shoulder as he rolled behind a boulder, his rifle lost in the fall. The warriors approached cautiously, their painted faces fierce with battle rage. Jacob closed his eyes, preparing for death, but instead of the bite of steel, he heard something that stopped his heart, the weak cry of a child. Hidden in a crevice behind the warriors was a small Comanche girl, no more than 7 years old, blood trickling from a wound on her forehead. She must have been caught in the crossfire, separated from her family in the chaos of battle. Without thinking, Jacob raised his hands in surrender and pointed toward the child. Asterisk, Hoopy.
Asterisk.
He said, using one of the few Comanche words he knew. Asterisk, child. Asterisk.
E.
The warriors hesitated, following his gaze to the injured girl. In that moment, something shifted in their eyes, from enemies to fellow human beings concerned for the same small life. Together, they pulled the girl from her hiding place, Jacob tearing strips from his uniform to bind her wounds while the warriors spoke to her in gentle tones. The girl's name was Ayana, eternal blossom in her people's tongue. As Jacob held pressure against her head wound, she looked up at him with eyes like dark pools, and something fundamental cracked open inside his chest. This was someone's daughter, someone's precious child, just like the settler children he had sworn to protect. One of the warriors, a young man named Dakota, gestured for Jacob to follow them. There was no time to consider the implications. The girl needed proper care, and Jacob found himself being led deeper into Comanche territory, a deserter by default, if not by choice. The Comanche camp nestled in a hidden valley, where cottonwoods grew thick along a clear-running stream. Teepees stood in careful arrangement, their buffalo hide walls painted with symbols that told the stories of generations. Children played between the dwellings, while women worked on crafts and prepared meals. their lives a tapestry of routine and tradition that Jacob had never bothered to imagine. Ayana's grandmother, a weathered woman named Nasha, took charge of the girl's care. Her hands gnarled with age but sure in their movements, cleaned and dressed the wound with herbs that Jacob didn't recognize. All the while, she studied him with sharp eyes that seemed to see straight through to his soul. Jacob expected to be killed or tortured. That's what he had been told happened to white captives. Instead, he found himself in a strange limbo, neither prisoner nor guest. The warriors who had brought him watched him constantly, but they also fed him and gave him a place to sleep. Days passed, then weeks, as Ayana slowly recovered. And Jacob began to understand that he was witnessing something the army had never taught him to see. These were not the savages of his nightmares. They were people, complex, loving, spiritual people with rich traditions and deep connections to the land. Children laughed and played games that reminded him of his own childhood in Ohio. Mothers sang lullabies that needed no translation. Elders told stories around evening fires, their voices carrying the weight of centuries. And there was Ayana, growing stronger each day, teaching him words in her language with the patient enthusiasm of a born teacher. Taba, she would say, pointing to the sun. Tuka, when she showed him a piece of meat. Slowly, awkwardly, Jacob began to communicate not just with her but with others in the tribe. It was Nasha who finally broke the silence about his fate. She approached him one evening, as he sat watching Ayana play with the other children, her head wound now just a thin scar beneath her black hair. "You saved her," the old woman said in careful English. "Why?" Jacob struggled to find the words. "She was hurt. She was just a child." Nasha nodded slowly. "The others want to trade you back to the soldiers, but I think," she paused, studying his face in the firelight. "I think maybe the spirits brought you here for a different reason." That night, Jacob lay awake staring at the stars through the smoke hole of the teepee, where he slept. He thought about his life before, the farm in Ohio, where he had grown up, the sweetheart he had left behind when he enlisted, the dreams of glory and honor that had brought him west. All of it seemed like another man's memories now. He thought about Colonel Hayes and the campaign to clear the Comanche from their sacred lands. He wondered if his unit thought he was dead, if they were still out there somewhere, preparing for the final assault. The thought made his stomach churn with guilt and fear. But when morning came, and he saw Ayana running to greet him with a handful of wild flowers, her face bright with joy, Jacob realized that something inside him had fundamentally changed. These people had shown him mercy when they could have shown him death. They had given him a glimpse of a different way of living, one based on harmony with the land rather than conquest of it. As summer turned to autumn, Jacob found himself becoming part of the tribe's daily rhythm. He helped with hunts, learned to work with leather and bone, and slowly became fluent in their language. The warriors still watched him, but with less suspicion and more curiosity. Some even began to teach him their ways, how to read the signs of weather in the clouds, how to move silently through the forest, how to see the land as a living thing rather than a resource to be exploited. It was during this time that he met Ayana's aunt Kimmy, secret, in English, though there was nothing secretive about the way she looked at him. She was perhaps 25, with long black hair that caught the light like silk, and eyes that held depths of wisdom and sadness. Her husband had been killed in a cavalry raid 2 years earlier, leaving her childless and alone. Their courtship, if it could be called that, unfolded slowly and without words, shared glances across the cooking fires, her hand briefly touching his when she passed him food, the way she lingered when she brought medicine for a cut on his hand. Jacob felt himself falling into something deeper than desire, a connection that transcended language and culture, two souls recognizing each other across the divide of their different worlds. The first time they spoke alone, they were gathering berries by the stream, while Ayana played in the shallows. Kimmy's English was better than she had let on, learned from traders and missionaries who had passed through over the years. "You are not like the other soldiers," she said. Her voice soft as the wind through the grass. "Maybe I never was," Jacob replied. "I just didn't know it until I came here." She turned to look at him, and in her eyes he saw something that made his heart race. "What will you do when they come for you?" "Because they will come." Jacob had been dreading that question. the one that haunted his dreams and followed him through his days. He was a deserter now, a man without a country. The army would hunt him as a traitor, while his own people would see him as someone who had gone native, betraying his race and his duty. I don't know, he admitted. I only know that I can't go back to the way things were. That night, as the tribe slept around them, Kimi came to his teepee. They made love with a desperate tenderness, as if they could hold back the approaching storm through the strength of their connection. In her arms, Jacob found a peace he had never known, a sense of belonging that had nothing to do with the color of his skin or the uniform he had once worn. But peace was not to last. The scouts brought word in late October. A large cavalry force was approaching from the east, not just soldiers, but a civilian wagon train as well. Families seeking new land, protected by 2 companies of cavalry. They were heading straight for the sacred grounds, where the Comanche buried their dead, intending to establish a permanent settlement. The war council met that night, and Jacob was allowed to sit with them, a privilege that would have been unthinkable months earlier. The debate was fierce and urgent. Some wanted to attack immediately, drive off the invaders before they could establish a foothold. Others counseled patience, hoping the soldiers would turn back on their own. Chief Tahatan, a man whose weathered face bore the scars of a dozen battles, spoke with the authority of age and experience. They bring women and children, he said. If we attack, many innocents will die. But if we do nothing, they will take our sacred ground, build their houses on the bones of our ancestors. There is another way, said Nasha, her voice cutting through the argument like a blade. All eyes turned to her as she continued. We have among us one who belongs to both worlds, and neither. Perhaps he can make them understand. Jacob felt every gaze in the circle turn to him. His mouth went dry as he realized what she was suggesting. You want me to talk to them? You know their language, their ways, Chief Tahatan said. If anyone can make them see reason, but Jacob was already shaking his head. You don't understand. I'm a deserter.
Oh.
The moment they see me, they'll put me in chains. And even if they listened, which they won't, they'll never turn back. The railroad wants this land, the government wants it. A few words from a traitor won't change that. The council fell silent, the weight of impossible choices settling over them like a burial shroud. Jacob excused himself and walked into the night, needing air and space to think. He found Kimi by the stream, her face lifted to the star-filled sky. She didn't speak when he approached, but her hand found his in the darkness. There has to be another way, he said finally. What if there isn't? She replied. What if this is how it ends, with blood and sorrow, the way it always ends? Jacob pulled her close, breathing in the scent of sage and sweetgrass that always seemed to cling to her hair. I won't let that happen. There has to be something. But even as he spoke the words, he could feel the weight of history pressing down on them. How many times had this same scene played out across the frontier? How many lovers had held each other close, while the world prepared for war around them? The answer came to him 3 days later, as he sat with Ayanna by the burial ground, where her grandfather lay beneath a cairn of stones. She was showing him how to weave grass into patterns, her small fingers quick and sure as she worked. My grandmother says the spirits are restless, she said without looking up from her weaving. She says they know what's coming. Jacob watched her work, this child who had become like a daughter to him, and suddenly he knew what he had to do. It was so simple, so obvious, that he wondered why he hadn't seen it before. The only way to prevent a massacre was to give both sides something they valued more than victory. That evening, he called for another council. When the warriors and elders had gathered, Jacob stood in their center and spoke in Comanche, his words careful and deliberate. You have shown me great kindness, he began. You took in an enemy, and made him family. You taught me that the world is bigger than the hatred men carry in their hearts. Now I ask you to let me repay that kindness. He outlined his plan, watching their faces as understanding dawned. When he finished, the circle was silent for a long moment. Chief Tahatan was the first to speak. You ask us to let you die. I ask you to let me live, Jacob replied. Not in body perhaps, but in the peace that my death might bring. If I offer myself as ransom for this land, both sides will have to stop and consider. The soldiers will have their deserter, your people will have their sacred ground, and maybe, just maybe, some children on both sides will live to see another sunrise. And if they refuse, asked Dakota, the young warrior who had helped rescue Ayanna. If they take your life and still demand our land. Jacob met his eyes steadily. Then at least I will have tried, and my death will be on their heads, not yours. The debate that followed was fierce and emotional. Some called him a fool. Others questioned his motives, wondering if this was some elaborate trick to help his own people. But in the end, it was Kimi who spoke the words that decided it. He offers his life for all of us, she said, tears streaming down her face. Who are we to refuse such a gift? The next morning, Jacob prepared to meet the approaching column. He bathed in the stream where he had spent so many peaceful hours, then dressed in a combination of his old cavalry uniform and Comanche ceremonial garb, a visible symbol of the two worlds he carried within himself. Kimi helped him paint his face with the symbols of a warrior going to his death, her hands trembling as she worked. Neither of them spoke. Words seemed inadequate for what they were feeling. Ayanna came to say goodbye, pressing a small woven bracelet into his hands. So you won't forget us, she whispered. Never, Jacob promised, kneeling to hug her one last time. You saved me, little one. You made me remember what it means to be human. Chief Tahatan and 20 warriors accompanied him to the edge of the sacred ground, where they would wait and watch. If his sacrifice was accepted, they would withdraw. If not, Jacob preferred not to think about that possibility. The wagon train appeared at midday, a long line of canvas-covered wagons escorted by blue-uniformed cavalry. Jacob could make out families walking alongside the wagons, women in sunbonnets, children running between the wheels, men with rifles slung across their shoulders. They looked tired and dusty from weeks on the trail, but their faces held the determined hope of people seeking a new life. At the head of the column rode Colonel Hayes himself, his face grim beneath the brim of his hat. When he spotted Jacob walking toward them across the open ground, his hand went immediately to his sidearm. Jesus Christ, Jacob heard him mutter. It's Whitmore. The column halted as Jacob approached. He could feel hundreds of eyes upon him, could hear the murmur of voices as word spread through the wagons that a deserter had been found. Some of the settlers looked frightened, others angry, but all of them were curious about this strange figure in his mixed uniform, walking alone across the prairie. Captain Jacob Whitmore, Hayes called out when Jacob was within speaking distance. You are under arrest for desertion in the face of the enemy. I know, Jacob replied, stopping about 20 feet from the colonel's horse. I've come to surrender. About damn time. Hayes gestured to 2 of his soldiers. Sergeant Mitchell, place this man in irons. Wait, Jacob said, raising his hand. There's something you need to know first, something that might save lives. Hayes' eyes narrowed. You're hardly in a position to negotiate, deserter. I'm not negotiating, Jacob said. I'm offering information about the Comanche war party that's watching us right now. The effect was instantaneous. Soldiers raised their rifles, scanning the horizon. Settlers screamed and dove for cover behind their wagons. Children began to cry as their mothers pulled them close. Where? Hayes demanded, his own rifle now in his hands. Jacob pointed toward the ridge where he knew Chief Tahatan and his warriors waited. 20 of them, maybe more. They've been tracking you for 2 days. Why haven't they attacked? Because I asked them not to. The words hung in the air like smoke. Hayes stared at Jacob as if he had grown a second head. You asked them? This is sacred ground, Colonel. The place where they bury their dead, where their ancestors' spirits rest. You can't settle here without starting a war that will cost hundreds of lives. Like hell we can't. Hayes spat. This is American territory now. Bought and paid for. If the savages don't like it, they can move on. And if they won't, then we'll make them. Jacob had expected this response, but hearing it still made his heart sink. He tried one more appeal to reason. Colonel, there are women and children in that wagon train. Good people looking for a new life. Do you really want their blood on your hands because you were too proud to find a compromise? The only compromise I'm interested in is watching you hang. Hayes replied. Sergeant Mitchell, arrest this traitor. As the soldiers moved toward him, Jacob played his final card. I offer myself in exchange for safe passage. The words stopped the soldiers in their tracks. Hayes frowned, clearly confused. What did you say? I offer my life in exchange for safe passage through this land, Jacob repeated, speaking loudly enough for the entire column to hear. Take me back to Fort Gibson. Court-martial me, hang me if you want. But leave this place in peace. You're in no position to make deals, Hayes said. But Jacob could hear uncertainty creeping into his voice. Actually, I am. Jacob turned to address the settlers directly, many of whom had emerged from behind their wagons to listen. You came here looking for a new life. But this land is already spoken for. The Comanche consider it sacred, and they'll fight to protect it. That means war. A war your children will pay the price for. A woman near the front of the group stepped forward. She was perhaps 30, with kind eyes and calloused hands that spoke of hard work and harder choices. What are you saying? She asked. I'm saying there's other land. Good land. 50 miles north of here. Land that's not sacred. Not worth dying for. The Comanche will let you pass if you give me to them for justice. Justice? Hayes laughed harshly. You mean execution? Jacob met his eyes steadily. Maybe. Or maybe something else. The point is nobody else has to die. The debate that followed was fierce and confused. Settlers argued among themselves while soldiers maintained their weapons ready. Some called Jacob a coward and a traitor. Others wondered aloud if he might be right about finding other land. But it was a child who changed everything. A little girl, perhaps 8 years old, who slipped away from her mother and walked up to Jacob with the fearless curiosity of youth. Mister, she said, are you really going to let them hurt you so we can live? Jacob knelt down to meet her eyes, seeing in them an echo of Ayana's innocence. If it means you get to grow up safe and happy, then yes. The child's mother hurried forward to pull her back, but not before the girl had asked one more question. Why would you do that for strangers? Jacob smiled, feeling a peace settle over him that he hadn't expected. Because someone once taught me that we're all connected. That love is stronger than hate, and that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is choose to see the humanity in people who are different from you. The girl's mother looked at him with something like wonder in her eyes. Around them the argument was dying down as people began to really consider what he was offering. It was Colonel Hayes who finally broke the silence. This is ridiculous. We have our orders. We're settling this land, and no deserter is going to change that. But Sergeant Mitchell, a grizzled veteran with 20 years of frontier service, stepped forward. Begging your pardon, Colonel, but maybe we should listen to him. I've seen enough Indian wars to know how they end. If these people want to find other land, I didn't ask for your opinion, Sergeant. No, sir, but you're getting it anyway. Mitchell's voice was firm but respectful. This man's offering to trade his life for our passage. That's the kind of courage I joined the army to protect. Other voices began to join in. Soldiers and settlers alike speaking up for Jacob's proposal. Not all of them, but enough to create doubt. Hayes looked around at the faces of his command, and the people he was supposed to protect, seeing his authority slowly eroding. Finally the colonel made his decision. Fine, he said through gritted teeth. But I want it understood that this changes nothing. We'll move to other land for now, but this territory will be settled eventually. And you, he pointed at Jacob, will still face court-martial for desertion. I understand, Jacob replied. As the column prepared to move out, Jacob was allowed to walk back toward the ridge where the Comanche warriors waited. He could feel hundreds of eyes watching him, could sense the mixture of admiration, confusion and disgust in the gazes that followed him. Halfway to the ridge, he stopped and turned back one final time. The little girl who had spoken to him was watching from beside her mother's wagon. He raised his hand in farewell, and she waved back. When Jacob reached the waiting warriors, Chief Tahatan looked at him with something like pride in his eyes. It is done, the chief asked in Comanche. It is done, Jacob replied. They will move on. Your sacred ground is safe. And you? Jacob smiled, thinking of Kimi and Ayana waiting back at the camp. I go to face whatever comes next. But what came next was not what anyone expected. As Jacob prepared to surrender himself to the cavalry, a commotion arose from the wagon train. Riders were approaching from the east, not soldiers but civilians. As they drew closer, Jacob could see they were officials of some kind with papers and documents that seemed to carry great authority. The lead rider dismounted and approached Colonel Hayes with a bearing that suggested he was used to being obeyed. Jacob was too far away to hear their conversation, but he could see Hayes' face growing redder with each word spoken. Finally, the colonel turned and bellowed across the prairie. Whitmore, Get back here. Jacob exchanged glances with Chief Tahatan, who nodded permission. Together, the warrior and the deserter walked back toward the wagon train, uncertain what new development awaited them. The official who had just arrived was a thin man in a dusty suit, with the pale complexion of someone who spent most of his time indoors. He introduced himself as Theodore Marsh, territorial representative of the Bureau of Indian Affairs. Mr. Whitmore, Marsh said, consulting a sheaf of papers. I understand you've been living with the Comanche for several months. Yes, sir. And you speak their language. Some of it, yes. Marsh nodded approvingly. Excellent. We have need of interpreters, men who understand both cultures and can help negotiate peaceful solutions to conflicts like this one. Jacob stared at him, hardly daring to believe what he was hearing. I don't understand. The territorial government has decided to try a new approach to Indian relations, Marsh explained. Rather than simply driving out the native tribes, we want to establish formal treaties that recognize certain lands as sacred or reserved while opening others to settlement. It's a delicate process that requires people who can speak both languages, literally and figuratively. Colonel Hayes was sputtering with indignation. This man is a deserter. He belongs in front of a firing squad. Actually, Marsh said mildly, he belongs wherever the territorial government decides he can do the most good. I have here a presidential pardon for Jacob Whitmore, contingent on his acceptance of a position as cultural liaison with the Comanche Nation. The next few hours passed in a blur of negotiations, translations, and carefully worded agreements. Jacob found himself serving as interpreter between Chief Tahatan and the government officials, helping to craft a treaty that recognized the sacred burial ground as permanently protected, while opening other lands to limited settlement. It wasn't perfect, no treaty ever was, but it was a beginning, a recognition that both cultures could coexist if people were willing to listen to each other. As the sun began to set, the wagon train prepared to move on to their new destination. The settlers seemed satisfied with the compromise, especially after Jacob assured them that the new land was actually better for farming than what they would have found here. Colonel Hayes, however, was not satisfied. As his soldiers prepared to depart, he confronted Jacob one final time. Don't think this changes anything, he said. You're still a traitor in my book, and mark my words, this peace won't last. It never does. Jacob met his gaze steadily. Maybe not forever, Colonel, but maybe long enough for some children to grow up without knowing war. That's worth something, isn't it? Hayes spat in the dust and walked away without answering. As the cavalry disappeared into the gathering darkness, Jacob found himself alone with Chief Tahatan and the government officials. Marsh was explaining his new duties. He would live part-time with the Comanche, part-time in the territorial capital, serving as translator and negotiator whenever conflicts arose. It won't be easy, Marsh warned. Both sides will suspect your motives. Some will call you a traitor to your race. Others will say you're a spy for the white man. I know, Jacob replied. But someone has to build bridges between the two worlds, and I've learned that love is stronger than hatred if you give it a chance. That night, Jacob returned to the Comanche camp to find the entire tribe gathered around the central fire. Kimmy rushed into his arms, tears of joy streaming down her face. Ayana danced around them both, chattering excitedly about how brave he had been. Chief Tahatan called for silence and spoke to the assembled tribe about the treaty that had been negotiated. There was some grumbling. No one liked the idea of sharing their land with outsiders, but most seemed satisfied that their sacred places would remain protected. Jacob Whitmore has shown us something today, the chief concluded. He has shown us that courage comes in many forms. Sometimes it means fighting your enemies. Sometimes it means learning to live with them. And sometimes it means offering your life for something greater than yourself. As the celebration continued into the night, Jacob found himself sitting apart with Kimmy, watching the stars appear one by one in the darkening sky. What happens now? She asked, her head resting against his shoulder. Now we try to build something new, he replied. A way for two peoples to share the same land without destroying each other. And us. Jacob turned to look at her, seeing his future reflected in her dark eyes. I was hoping you might consider marrying a man who belongs to two worlds and neither. Her answer was a kiss that tasted of sage and starlight and the promise of tomorrow. Nasserist. 5 years later, Jacob Whitmore stood on the porch of his cabin, watching his daughter chase fireflies in the gathering dusk. At 3 years old, little Sarah was already bilingual, chattering away in English and Comanche with equal fluency. Her mother, Kimmy, was teaching other settlement children the Comanche language while Jacob worked with tribal leaders to establish trading agreements that benefited both communities. The peace wasn't perfect. There were still incidents, still misunderstandings and conflicts that required careful negotiation. But the sacred burial ground remained untouched, and children from both cultures played together in the valley that had once been a place of division. As Sarah ran toward him with her small hands cupped around a captured firefly, Jacob thought about the choice he had made that day 5 years ago. He had been prepared to die for peace, but instead he had been given the chance to live for it. "Papa," Sarah called out in Comanche. "Look, I caught a star." Jacob knelt down to examine her prize, smiling at her wonder. "So you did, little star catcher. What will you do with it?" "Set it free," she said without hesitation, opening her hands to let the firefly escape. Stars are meant to be free. As they watched the tiny light disappear into the darkness, Jacob felt Kimmy's hand slip into his. Around them, the sounds of two cultures blending together filled the evening air, English lullabies mixing with Comanche prayers, the laughter of children who saw no difference between themselves and others, the quiet conversations of adults who had learned that peace was possible when people chose love over fear. Jacob had thought his story would end with sacrifice, with a noble death that might prevent a war. Instead, it had begun with something far more powerful, the recognition that true courage lies not in dying for what you believe, but in living for it every single day. The firefly Sarah had released joined the stars above, its small light adding to the vast tapestry of the night sky, and in that moment, Jacob understood the profound truth that would guide the rest of his days. Love truly does transcend all boundaries, not because it ignores the differences between people, but because it recognizes that those differences are what make the tapestry of humanity beautiful. In a world that often demanded you choose sides, Jacob had chosen something else entirely. He had chosen to be a bridge between worlds, a living testament to the idea that courage and compassion could triumph over hatred and fear. And in making that choice, he had found not just peace for two warring peoples, but a love that would endure for generations to come.